All right, let's just dive right into this explainer and try to unravel what might be the ultimate historical mystery. Why are some nations incredibly wealthy while others are seemingly trapped in poverty? I mean, people have been debating this for literally centuries. Is it culture, is it the weather, or is it something far deeper? Today, we're unpacking the groundbreaking insights from why nations fail. It's this fascinating look into how the actual rules of a society completely dictate whether it thrives or starves.
So, let's kick things off with part 1, A Tale of Two Cities. To find our very first clue, we're heading to a baffling, real-world paradox right on the border of the United States and Mexico. It's this wild place where you can basically stand in one spot and see two entirely different worlds. Just think about this stark contrast. In Nogales, Arizona, the average household is pulling in around $30,000 a year. Most adults have a high school degree, folks have access to Medicare, the roads are paved, and you don't really have to constantly look over your shoulder fearing for your safety. But literally just a few feet south of the fence, in Nogales, Sonora, the income completely plummets to a third of that. Mothers are dealing with high infant mortality, public health is struggling, and trying to open a business means navigating this massive maze of crime, red tape, and political corruption. And remember, these people share the exact same ancestors, the same culture, and the same food.
So how could two halves of the exact same city be so fundamentally different? It's crazy, right? This stark divide really hooks us into the central mystery, and it demands that we ask what invisible force is stopping prosperity dead in its tracks at a simple chain link fence. Because if it's not the people and it's not the culture, what on earth is happening here?
That brings us to part 2, the geography myth.
You know, for centuries, the most common suspect in this whole global inequality case has been the environment itself. People are always trying to blame Mother Nature for the wealth gap. I mean, just look at famous thinkers like the 18th century French philosopher Montesquieu. He championed what we call the geography hypothesis, basically claiming that hot climates inherently bred laziness and poverty, while temperate climates, well, they bred industriousness. And the wild thing is, even today, some modern economists echo a version of this, arguing that things like tropical diseases and poor soil are the primary roadblocks keeping places like Africa or Central America in poverty.
But here's the crucial point. Nogales absolutely destroys this myth. The climate and the diseases are identical on both sides of that border. Germs aren't stopping to ask for a passport at the US-Mexico fence. The soil is the exact same. The weather is the exact same. And that means geography is totally innocent here. We have to look somewhere else for our culprit.
Moving right along to part 3, the Spanish extraction model.
Okay, to uncover the actual root of this inequality, we need to do a little time traveling back to the 1500s and investigate the scene of the crime, which is the founding of the colonies in the Americas. We're going to see two radically different blueprints for building a society. Now, the Spanish conquistadors, guys like Hernán Cortés in Mexico and Francisco Pizarro in Peru, they used this brutal but highly effective three-step strategy to exploit needy populations. Step 1, capture the indigenous leader, like the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma or the Inca Emperor Atahualpa. Step 2, demand massive ransoms, just completely stripping those empires of all their accumulated gold and silver. And finally, Step 3, set themselves up as the new elite. They coerced massive local populations into forced labor systems, basically taxing them and working them to the bone just to extract every single ounce of wealth back to Spain.
And the sheer scale of this exploitation is honestly staggering. Take 1545, for example, when the Spanish discovered a literal mountain of silver in Bolivia. They called it El Cerro Rico. To mine it, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo instituted a system known as Demita. He basically drew up this massive catchment area which covered most of modern-day Bolivia and forced 1/7 of all adult males from those indigenous communities to march all the way to Potosí and toil in these deadly silver mines. The whole system was explicitly designed to crush indigenous living standards down to mere survival levels just so the Spanish elite could extract all the excess wealth.
Now let's contrast that with part 4, the English incentive model. So let's head up to North America and see how the English colonizers actually attempted to do the exact same thing as the Spanish, but were completely forced by circumstance to build a totally different system. The population density back then tells the whole story. While places like central Mexico or Andean Peru were densely packed, we're talking up to 400 people per square mile, the English arrived late to the game, landing in places like Virginia, and North America had a population density of less than 3/4 of a person per square mile. The English showed up totally expecting to capture a king and force the locals to dig for gold, but they couldn't. There wasn't any gold, and the indigenous population was just way too sparse and far too mobile to exploit.
And that reality led to this really fascinating chain of events. When the English arrived at Jamestown in 1607, they literally wasted their time searching for fool's gold instead of, actually planting food. And that mistake led right into the horrific starving time of 1609, where settlers got so desperate they even resorted to cannibalism. The ruling Virginia Company tried to set up draconian martial law to force their own colonists to work, but because there was just endless empty land everywhere, the colonists would simply run away to the frontier. So, unable to coerce the locals or their own people, the English had to make a desperate pivot. By 1618, they introduced the head right system, which basically granted 50 acres of private land to settlers, and soon after, they set up an assembly for political rights. They finally realized that the absolute only way to survive was to give the colonists a real, tangible incentive to work.
Which brings us to Part 5, the innovator versus the monopolist. Okay, let's fast forward to the modern era to see the ultimate payoff of these two totally diverging colonial blueprints, the Spanish model of extraction versus the English model of incentives. Because the United States developed political institutions that distributed power broadly, it organically led to open economic institutions. By 1914, there were nearly 28,000 highly competitive banks operating in the United States. That is a massive number. And what it meant was that anyone in the U.S. with a great idea, even someone poor and uneducated like Thomas Edison, who was literally homeschooled and started out splitting shingles, could easily walk in and get a low-interest loan. They could patent their invention, start a business, and actually keep the rewards of their own hard work.
Now, compare that to Mexico just a few years earlier, in 1910. There were only 42 banks operating in the entire country. And get this, just 2 of those banks controlled 60% of all banking assets. Mexico's financial system was this completely elite monopoly, which was a direct, lingering legacy of those Spanish extractive institutions. It was entirely shut off to everyday entrepreneurs. Those banks only lent money to the privileged and the already wealthy, while charging completely outrageous interest rates to everybody else.
You really clearly see how these historic systems dictate the modern origins of extreme wealth when you look at Bill Gates and Carlos Slim. Gates built his massive fortune because U.S. institutions enabled him to innovate, hire top talent, and scale up. And hey, when Microsoft got a little too powerful, the government actually stepped in with antitrust lawsuits to force a competitive market. But then look at Carlos Slim down in Mexico. He didn't build his primary fortune through technological innovation. Instead, he bought the privatized telecommunications monopoly, Telmex. And whenever competitors tried to challenge him, Slim would just use this Mexican legal loophole called an amparo to completely block the competition and cement his monopoly. What's super fascinating is that when Slim tried to use those exact same monopolistic tactics to buy the retailer CompUSA in the United States, a Dallas court heavily fined him. Why? Because U.S. institutions simply do not allow it. One system is built to reward brilliant innovators, while the other is set up to enrich monopolists who exploit political favors.
And finally, Part 6, the power of institutions.
So pulling all these threads together, the great mystery of Nogales is finally solved. That stark divide between those two halves of the city is the direct result of hundreds of years of diverging history. It's not the climate, it's not the soil, it's not the germs. It is human-made institutions. Economic and political institutions are essentially the rules of the game. They completely dictate whether a nation creates inclusive incentives, letting people innovate, patent ideas, and access credit, or whether a nation sets up extractive institutions, which are designed purely to funnel the wealth of the masses right into the pockets of a narrow, powerful elite. The reason Nogales, Arizona is prosperous is because its citizens live under rules that actually reward their effort. Meanwhile, Nogales, Sonora struggles because it inherited an extractive system that just throws up insurmountable barriers for the average person.
And this brings us to a truly critical realization. Global inequality isn't just some accident of geography, it's a choice made by those in power. So as you look around at your own government and economy today, I want you to really think about the rules governing your life. You have to ask yourself, are you living in a system designed to extract your wealth, or are you in one designed to unlock your potential? Basically, which side of the fence are you truly living on? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.